Today is October 29th, 2020, and the 2020 presidential election is now only 5 days away. This presidential election will have Joe Biden and Donald Trump competing against each other to see who can get more electoral votes in the Electoral College, because that is ultimately what determines the winner of a presidential election, who can get a majority of the votes in the Electoral College. There are 538 electoral votes in total, so a presidential candidate needs at least 270 of those in order to actually become president. So, in just 5 days from now, on November 3rd, 2020, we can finally start to get a good idea of who will win this presidential election. The final results most likely won't be determined on Tuesday night because of mail in ballots. A lot of them won't be able to come in until the days after November 3rd. So we're not going to know for sure who won on November 3rd, but we'll start to get a good idea of what the race looks like on that day. A lot of people think that the polls that were taken in 2016 regarding the Hillary Clinton versus the Donald Trump race 4 years ago, a lot of those people think that the polls taken back then were not very accurate because they weren't able to predict Donald Trump's victory. And as a result, they now look at the state of the current presidential race with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And even though Joe Biden is ahead by several percentage points in the polls, a lot of people look at the polls and say that that's not indicative of a Joe Biden win in the presidential election that is now just 5 days away. A lot of people think that the polls are wrong and that Donald Trump will still be able to win this presidential election, or that he still has a good chance of winning this presidential election. And I'm making this video to tell you guys why it is not fair to compare the current presidential race to the 2016 presidential race. Because there are several differences between 2016 and 2020 that I would like to talk about now. And these differences are the reason why Donald Trump will lose this presidential election despite winning the one 4 years ago in 2016. So let's begin with that now. The first reason, and probably the most obvious reason, and probably the reason that puts 2020 sets 2020 apart from 2016 in many ways, is the COVID-19 pandemic. 4 years ago, there was no pandemic that was ravaging throughout the United States and every other country in the world. There was no pandemic that killed 220,000 people in the United States and hundreds of thousands of other people across the world just 5 days before Election Day. Back in 2016, there was no such pandemic, but in 2020, we now have that pandemic that unfortunately not only exists but has been very, very deadly. So that is one of the biggest differences between 2016 and 2020. You had no major crisis in 2016 that was taking the lives of thousands across the country and thousands more across the world. Besides that, there was also one other crisis that was not there in 2016 that we now have, and that is the crisis of police brutality and the crisis of the police disproportionately arresting African Americans compared to other races. Now, it's not that that issue didn't exist 4 years ago, it's that it wasn't really an issue that was talked about by either candidate much. Because of the George Floyd killing that took place earlier this year in the end of May 2020, because of the killing of him by Derek Chauvin when Derek Chauvin placed his knee on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes, that is what sparked lots of social unrest across the country. There were many protests across the country, there were even a few riots across the country, but that singular event is what brought the whole topic of police brutality to the forefront of political discussion. And ever since then, it has been a pretty important issue for the 2020 presidential race. That was not there in 2016, that is there now. And I think that Joe Biden has done a lot better on that specific issue than Donald Trump, mainly because of the fact that Donald Trump's rhetoric is pretty divisive, and sometimes that helps him because that really solidifies his support with his base. But if your base is not big enough to win a presidential election, or if it's not strong enough to win a presidential election, then that rhetorical strategy is not very effective. In 2016, Trump's rhetoric of just not giving a damn and insulting whoever, I think it was much more effective 4 years ago when there was no major crisis across the country. I think when there is lots of social unrest and when there's a deadly pandemic and when there's major crises in general, I think divisive rhetoric isn't really that effective in those scenarios because people are feeling pretty scared. People are really suffering not only health wise but also economically, also socially. Whenever you have all sorts of major crises taking place, like you do in 2020, that you haven't seen in any other year in recent history, whenever you have such unrest like we do now, like we see around us now, I think then people just want a unifying leader, a leader that is broadly appealing to everyone. The thing with Trump's rhetoric is that it was both one of his biggest strengths and one of his biggest weaknesses. It was a giant strength for him in that a lot of people liked that style of rhetoric. That style of rhetoric appealed to a lot of people because a lot of people perceived it as not holding back, not covering things up, being honest with everyone, just telling it how it is basically. A lot of people really liked that style of rhetoric because they felt he was being honest. He was telling the truth, he wasn't sugarcoating things. And a lot of people, if they weren't happy with their lives, they would appreciate that sort of rhetoric more because a lot of people perceived it as him telling the truth about the system, about the establishment, as he would call it. So that was one of his biggest strengths, but in a year like 2020, I would say that's one of his biggest weaknesses because in a time when you have a pandemic, social unrest, and other crises like the economic crisis that will leave millions of people potentially homeless, his divisive rhetoric is not very effective because people just want to return back to a sense of normality and they just want a calm, unifying leader that can stable things down, that can make things more stable, that can bring the country together and fight a common enemy, which in this case is the pandemic and the social unrest as well as the terrible economy. So that's why I think there's a giant difference between 2016 and 2020. Now, going back to the pandemic, no matter who is the president right now, if it was Hillary Clinton, for example, a lot of people would be perceiving Hillary Clinton negatively just because of the fact that a pandemic happened under her. But because Donald Trump's currently the incumbent president and there's a major crisis that's happening under him, some people are just going to associate the pandemic with Donald Trump. So that's not necessarily a shortcoming of Trump. It's just that that was unfortunate for him that the pandemic just happened to take place in the last year of his first term. I think that that was very unfortunate for Trump, and in many ways, the pandemic was unavoidable. But at the same time, a lot of people feel that Trump could have done more to stop this pandemic, done more to prevent this from spreading. And in some ways, they're right because 200,000 people, more than 200,000 people, have died in the United States. The United States only has around 4 to 5% of the world's population, but we have almost a quarter of the world's deaths. So if you look at that, if you just look at those two statistics, then you can see by that that the United States has objectively done a bad job of handling this pandemic, but also you can't really just blame it only on Trump. You definitely can blame it on Trump and his administration, but you also have to look at the local leaders, the governors, the mayors. You have to look at every level of the government because I think there's been some sort of failure at every single level of government. It's not just at the top. It's also the senators, the governors, the mayors, even a city council in some instances. Can't just blame one person or one administration. Got to look at the thing as a whole. Besides that, there's also the fact that the polls actually weren't that inaccurate in 2016. A lot of people say that the polls were completely off in 2016, that they did not at all predict Trump winning in 2016. The truth is, that's just not the case. Take a look now at the polls that were taken 4 years ago on the days leading up to Election Day specifically. Take a look at the polls that were issued just around a week or two before Election Day because those are the ones that matter the most. The polls issued months before Election Day aren't really that important because there's still lots of room for things to change when the election's still a few months away. But look at the polls issued specifically a week or two before Election Day. You'll notice that these polls in general have Clinton ahead of Trump by around 3 to 4 percentage points, more or less. Maybe some of them have Clinton up 5 to 6 points. Maybe some of them have Clinton up like 0 to 1 percentage points. Or maybe some of them even have Trump up by a couple percentage points. But look at the national average, specifically the national polls, the general population of the United States, those polls. Look at those specifically in the weeks leading up to Election Day back in 2016, 4 years ago. Look at the average of the nationwide polls. If you look at the average, it was only around 3 percentage points in Clinton's favor, meaning that on average, Clinton was only doing better than Trump by around 3 percentage points on average if you take all the polls leading up to Election Day 4 years ago, which really is not that much. 3 points, a 3 point deficit in the polls is really not that hard to overcome if you have a stronger base that's willing to actually turn out to vote. And that is exactly what happened in 2016 because the polls showed that Clinton would win by around 3 percentage points. The other thing that people fail to realize or fail to remember is the fact that, yes, Trump won the presidency, but who got the most amount of votes? Hillary Clinton did. So the polls actually did predict that. The polls said Hillary Clinton would get more votes. Hillary Clinton got more votes. The polls actually don't predict the winner of the Electoral College. They are much better at predicting the winner of the popular vote. Because what do these polls do? They poll people across the country and they just ask for people's vote across the country. So it's a good indicator of what the popular vote will be leading up to an election, but it's not really as good of an indicator of the Electoral College result because the election is not determined by the national popular vote, it's determined by who wins each state and which candidate can win the right states to where their Electoral College amount adds up to at least 270. And I'll concede this. If you look at polls taken at the state level, for example, polls taken specifically in Ohio or specifically in Florida, for example, yes, those polls weren't completely accurate, but that's not really a fault on the polls themselves. That's just because of the fact that there were not enough polls taken in any of these states. If you look at the nationwide polls in 2016, there were many of those, especially in the weeks leading up to election day. You had enough polls to where they could pretty accurately determine who would win the popular vote of the election. But if you went to the state level, there really weren't that many polls taken just at the state level for a specific state. And when you don't have that many polls, the polls themselves are not going to be as accurate, not because the polls themselves weren't done properly. It's just that you need a higher sample size, a higher amount of polls in order for the average of the polls to be close to the actual result. So it's just the fact that in 2016 there weren't enough polls taken in each individual state, so the electoral college count was undercounted for Trump and overcounted for Clinton by a bit. But here's the thing, the polls at the state level weren't just undercounted for Trump. Some states, Clinton performed better in the actual election than the polls would expect. Like in 2016 for Nevada, the polls expected Clinton to win by just 1 to 2 percentage points, but she actually won by almost 4 percentage points. So it doesn't just go one way, it can go both ways. In 2016, that's what happened. It went both ways, but I guess in the states that mattered more, it went in the way where Trump was undercounted in the polls and he did better on election day in the Rust Belt states, and the Rust Belt states were ultimately what gave him the victory 4 years ago. But 4 years ago is not today. 4 years ago is not today. Look at 538.com. I've mentioned this website so many times on this channel, but that's because it's just that good of a website. It's just that good of a polling prediction model. Look at how likely it is that Trump wins now. I just went on this morning. It only gives Trump an 11% chance of winning now compared to Joe Biden's 89. That is a pretty low chance of winning. And if you also look at the national polls with Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, the gap between Donald Trump and Joe Biden now is much bigger than in 2016. In 2016, the polls leading up to election day just showed Clinton up by around 3 percentage points. Now, they show Joe Biden up by at least 8 percentage points. Anywhere from 8 to 10 percentage points, Joe Biden is up by in the nationwide polls. And yes, I've already said this, the popular vote doesn't determine the winner of the election. The Electoral College does, but when you're up by over 8 percentage points in the national popular vote, it is nearly impossible to win the Electoral College. That is just a fact. So that is why I think Joe Biden will almost certainly win this election. Also, going back to my 538 example, on election day, the morning of, not Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton was given a 70% chance of winning. Trump was given a 30% chance of winning, which is actually not low at all. 30% is actually a decent chance. Granted, it's less than 50%, meaning Hillary Clinton had a better chance, but 30% is actually not even that low of a chance. So all the people saying Clinton had a 99% chance of winning, yes, they were wrong, but I don't think 538 was wrong because it did look like in 2016 that Clinton had a better chance, but Trump was able to pull off a surprise victory in 3 of the states in the Rust Belt that helped him win. So now 538.com only gives Trump an 11% chance of winning, and this is just 5 days before election day. So I think Trump's chances of winning now are much lower in 2016, and in all likelihood, almost certainly Joe Biden will win this presidential election. Trump needs a major miracle now if he still wants to win.